Thanks for coming today. I'm really excited to be presenting this, so I'm glad you're here because this is an idea that we've had formulating for a long time. We had all this email list data that we didn't quite know what to do with until we had the idea that we could analyze it like a social network, and it's been formulating for a while. So I'd just like to first thank some people in my social network that have helped with this. First, my colleagues Sandra and Zach for helping me learn about social networks and social network analysis, and do lots of theory exploration, and Sandra especially for helping me formulate a lot of these ideas that are going to be in the talk today. Some other colleagues that were also very helpful, the Learners Project, and especially Nane and Alan for all of their help with their advice about software to use to get into social network analysis. Nane's been really helpful with helping me learn how to do this. And then the workshop organizers and facilitators, as well as the University of Colorado DBER group, who both gave me some great feedback on some earlier versions of this talk and helped it get to where it is today. So since this is about social networks, and part of social networks is how ideas flow through them, I want to start with an idea that I picked up from hanging around a bunch of mathematicians over the past few years. So a couple of axioms I'm going to start with today. IBL is good for students. Workshops are an effective way to spread IBL. Just going to accept that those are true. If you want some evidence, this thing works. Oh, there we go. If you want some evidence, we do have a paper that came out and drew about those things last year. And then today what I hope to show is evidence for some ongoing support after the workshops, and be talking about how this e-mentoring works. Alright, so the framework that I'm using today is kind of just a simple three-stage model for how instructors change what they're doing. So if you want somebody to go from lecture to something else, how do you do that, right? So the first stage would be unfreezing, where you get them some motivation, some reason to change. Changing is where they actually learn it, they try it out. And then the last stage that I'm going to focus on today really is this refreezing stage. So the idea of after they've tried, what can you do to make sure that they maintain those changes going forward and they keep using them, and that they become like their new normal in a sense, and they don't just go back to what they were doing before they came to the workshop. The first and second stage, again, that paper that we had published last year covered those in more detail, but today we're really going to be focusing on that. Alright, so particularly that last refreezing stage, there's not much known about this. One, because it's hard to study, and it's often not successful. In particular, there are lots of people who have plans to do it, but you don't really see a lot of research about what happens when they do that. It's particularly challenging because participants come to a workshop and then they go back to their home institutions. They're all spread out. They're hard to contact, but there's some evidence that having, or some arguments at least I should say, that having supportive like-minded colleagues can be really important to get that kind of support from people if they're not getting it at their home institutions. And a little bit of evidence that these interactions with colleagues are actually more influential than going to PD in some contexts. Alright, so today we're going to look kind of at three things. What resources the workshops can use to support participants, how to maximize online support, and then kind of what that process is of refreezing and reconfirmation through that refreezing stage. Basically learning that, or the idea of getting feedback about these new methods and confirming that you want to keep using them. So a little context, this is one workshop from the 2014 cohort of three different workshops that were offered from 13 to 15, so we just kind of picked the middle one. They're all 4 days long, served about 40 participants each. There are 4 types of sessions in there. There's reading sessions where they read and discuss articles, video sessions, they watch IBL inquiry-based learning classrooms, nuts and bolts sessions where they learn about the actual nuts and bolts of doing this in their classroom, how to manage a class day to day, and then the content sessions where they develop notes to use in their course. Another component of the workshops is the ongoing e-mentoring, which is going to be a big feature of the talk today. And then for our purposes as the evaluators and researchers on this, we use pre, post, and follow-up surveys. And then we also have been tracking all the network activity on an email listserv that they have. And we've done that for all the studies in this project, but today we're just going to be focusing on the one in the middle because it's pretty, let's go all the way through this statement, pretty comprehensive. So just real quick, the workshops are highly successful no matter how we measure it. There's reporting high uptake of IBL in different ways on follow-up surveys through their descriptions on the email list itself. Also, we look at changing their teaching practices before they come to the workshop and then a year after they go to the workshop. We see changes that are consistent with what we'd expect to see in IBL. And then the impact of these workshops. So on that one-year follow-up survey, after they've had a year following the workshop to go back and teach, people reported using IBL at almost 80 classes, reaching almost 1,900 students. And again, that is just the first year following the workshop. So that's the impact, first academic year afterwards, and then presumably the years after that, the impact would be even growing. So what resources do workshops use to support participants through this refreezing stage after they've gone back? One is IBL-related events. Inquiry-based learning is pretty established by this point. It's been around for quite a while. So there are lots of events like the Joint Math Meetings has IBL-related events, MAA, stuff like that. One key here is that there's a lot of variety, and that seems to help people can find something that they can use. So one way is the workshops help plug people into those events. Another one is different IBL-related resources, Journal of Inquiry-Based Learning in Mathematics, different blogs and websites about IBL, stuff like that. Again, people use those. There's a lot of variety that's helpful, and the workshops help support that by making people aware of them. So looking at the colleagues back in their home institutions, we asked this on the follow-up survey. As you can see, a lot of people who go to the workshop said that most of their colleagues, for the most part, are pretty supportive, right? But when we asked an open-ended descriptions of like, what does that look like, out of the 21 people who responded to the survey, only 12 of them reported some kind of active encouragement, right? The rest were just like a freedom to do what they wanted to, even though they felt supported. It's just kind of, they don't stop me from doing it kind of thing, right? So that's key that less than half report this kind of active encouragement or support that's really crucial to that refreezing stage. And that's what we're going to look at with the email listserv, is how that provides this more active stuff that they may be not getting from their colleagues in their own institutions. So why listservs? One, it's an easy way to mentor participants. I realize mentor is a very loaded word, so that's why it's in quotes up there. But you can use some functions of mentoring through an email list. Many professional development workshops say they have plans for this, but then when you see reports about them and papers, there's not really anything in the results of this, right? So even though people think it's an important thing, they make efforts to it, we don't really know much about it. But the listservs for these particular workshops have been consistently high. They've had, on average, more than 90% of the people active in them. So we thought it would be an interesting one to study. All right, so online supports. One thing I want to make a point of before we get into a lot of this network email listserv stuff. This group also set up a social network Facebook group. As you can see, 4 people exchanged 8 messages in 2 days following the workshop. Not a whole lot of activity. Compared to the listserv that we're going to look at, 91% of the participants were active. When you include all the leaders, 87%. They exchanged 281 messages in that first year, and still continues to be active now, even though it's 2.5 years later. There's still some activity on there. Not as much as there was in the beginning, but it's still active now. So one thing, the push technology helps. It gets pushed to you. You don't have to go search for it. It shows up in your inbox. Things that are relevant to you come straight to you. That seems to be an important finding for this. So one thing, look at a histogram of participation here based on number of messages per individual. So participants are in green, the workshop leaders are in purple. As you can see, most of the participants have 5 or fewer. There's a small group of them that are up in the 15 to 20 range for a number of messages they've sent in that first year following the workshop. Then way out at the end, you've got a staff member or a leader that's got about 70 messages, right? So key to this is that it takes work, right? It doesn't just happen. You have to promote participation. You have to keep it active. So looking a little bit more detailed here, this is just when the messages happen. So they're coded in 3 ways. The red is a new participant, meaning it's their first message on the listserv. The purple are the organizer prompts. So these are things coming from the workshop leaders that say, hey, we want to hear from you. Check in, let us know how things are going. Trying to invite some participation to the email list. And then the gray ones are ones that are just repeat messages from any participant, or anybody on the list, I should say. So, in January, so the workshops happen in the summer, they go back, they have fall to try to test some of this stuff out, and then in January, we do with these workshops is we check in with the quiet participants. So these are the people who haven't participated on the listserv yet. Send them an individual message, see how things are going, ask them to check in. If possible, get them to turn that into some kind of list activity. And what you'll notice is after that check-in, there are 2 people that even though they hadn't been active for 6 months or so before that, did end up becoming participants on the listserv too. So there are lots of different ways you can do it. One is keeping lots of activity, also making sure you're individually checking in with people. And then totally 94% of the participants were active on this listserv. Another thing that's important with these listservs is the relevance of the discussion. So notice this giant flurry of activity. This is the fall when people go back to their classrooms and start teaching, right? That's when they need a lot of discussion about what's going on, and a lot of discussion there and lots of prompts. There's another little flurry that happens in January. Some people don't teach in the fall, whatnot. In January it happens again, or if you taught in the fall, you've got new things to consider, you've got a little more experience, so there's another little flurry of activity that happens in January. Then it's kind of sporadic after this. We've looked at this kind of measure on about 7 workshops now, and they all follow the same pattern with lots of activity in the fall. It slows down a little bit, and then picks back up in January with the new term. And notice there's 2 people there who started in January, because they may not have been teaching in the fall. So did it help? On the follow-up surveys, most people said that yes, the email list was helpful in different ways. We're going to look at this in some colorful detail in a second here. All right. So basically what I did is this idea, we've got all this listserv activity, but want to know why it helps, right? So I had the idea to analyze it as a social network, not amongst the people, but amongst the messages that are being sent. We'll get into this a little bit. So because the listservs are so useful, we want to know why. And it just kind of made sense, that observing the list and seeing this, that social network analysis was a good way to kind of track these social connections and make sense out of what was going on. So it came out of our observation of the list being useful. Not, that we came in, we want to do this and set up the conditions for it. All right, so we're going to look at what this process is, reconfirmation through feedback, emotional and intellectual support on the list. So basically this is the way it worked. Every message that was sent on the list got coded in 2 ways. One, I coded it with a forward or generating function, I call it, which is basically the idea of you're trying to create conversation. You're asking a question, you're asking people to participate, stuff like that looks forward. Messages can also be coded with a backwards or response function. So this is the idea you're looking back, you're responding to a message that already happened. And these are coded not by thread because people are not very good about changing subject lines, as I'm sure you know if you've ever been on an email list. But this is an actual content analysis of the messages. So forward or generating functions, broadcast, sharing some information, celebrating, inviting participation. 2 kinds of seeking information and opinions. Basically the idea, information is like there's an answer out there. Opinions are you looking for advice. A little bit brings more discussion kind of. Also summarize messages, where these were offering a synthesis of kind of some different discussions that were going on, and then messages that were only a response. They weren't offering anything new to the list or anything that was meant to go forward. They're just responding back to prior messages. And we'll get through this in a bit more detail. Again, this came from the data itself, not from, it wasn't a framework we started with, it's coding from the actual data. So the way this is going to look in the pictures, the leaders are represented by squares. The participants are circles, so a broadcast message from a leader would show up as a black square, a seeking opinion message from a participant would show up as a red circle, and then a response message would show up as a blank or white circle. Okay, so we can also build in the connections, the backwards functions. These are things like chiming in, these are just checking in, here's what I'm doing in my class, here's how it's going. Expressing thanks, empathizing, or any kind of emotional support, providing information and providing opinions, kind of the response to the seeking. A follow-up message, so this is the idea that sometimes people will see something on the list, they'll have a discussion, and then a month later or so they'll say, hey, I tried it out, here's how it went. So it's follow-up with some time in between. Social messages, kind of what it says, like making plans to meet up at JMM or something like that. Okay, so what this looks like in the network, if we have a participant that asks a question, that red dot, seeking some opinions, somebody may respond by providing an opinion, and you'll see that as the arrow. So the arrow goes from the message to the one it responded to. So the way the arrow goes, right? So that white message is responding by providing an opinion to the original one that asked for an opinion. And then you'll see threads develop. People may provide an opinion about that opinion the other person did, or somebody may provide a different opinion and say, I hadn't thought of your strategy, thank you, and then see the arrow like that. All right, so code it all looks like this. Makes a lot of sense, right? Super confusing. We're going to break it down, but this is what the network looks like when you have the full network of all these email messages. And I think I mentioned it, but there were 281 in the year for this group. So a little bit of language. If we have a reference node, just kind of the things I'm talking, so any node here, but I'm just going to highlight that one as my reference node, we can look at how the other messages are connected to it. Any message that comes directly from it as a response to it is called a child message. Anything that happens later in the message is a descendant. So descendant, kind of like you would look at family trees, includes children and everybody that comes from that message, so anything in the discussion thread. And then parents and ancestors going the other direction, anything it came from. The other term I'm going to talk about is the reach, which is basically the size of the little subnetwork or the conversation. You could consider it with this email network, right? So in the one I looked over there, the reach would be any node in that can reach 4 other ones. Obviously in the one in the circle here towards the left, it reaches a lot more. It's a bigger subnetwork of messages. So the way this is arranged, the messages up at the top are isolates, meaning they had no responses. There's a row here that just kind of happened to be about the same number. These got 1 response. And then down here we have a lot more of the complex conversations that went on. And then also time is kind of represented in 2 dimensions. So within the isolates, this was the first isolate that went to the list, and then they get later on in the year as you go that way. Also conversations go down this way, right? So this is where it starts. These are the responses, responses to responses. So you kind of get a sense of time here. That's not to say that this was message 1 on the list and this was 2, maybe 1, then that was 2, then 3 was over here. So this is arranged to kind of show the flow of conversation more than the timing of it. We'll look at some other things too that show the timing of it better. Okay, so 2 that I just kind of want to draw your attention to. So in the black, again, we have the broadcast messages making announcements. And then the pink ones here are the summary messages. So notice how they function differently. Black, a lot of those are isolated messages or got a single response. There's a couple scattered throughout the more complex conversations. But they tend to be at the front. They don't come from anywhere. There's no parents on them, and you'll notice that they have fewer parents than average. Same thing with ancestors. Whereas summary messages tend to draw together lots of different messages and come towards the ends of threads. And you can see that's reflected in the counts of the average number of parents and ancestors are higher than the network as a whole. So just kind of to give you an idea of how some of the metrics work for this. Okay, so one function on these lists is seeking and providing information, right? So I've just highlighted that in blue here. And what you'll notice with a lot of these is that they tend to have fewer parents, meaning that they start discussions. It's usually a way to start discussions by seeking input, right? Seeking opinions, one thing that pops out to me is just how much of that goes on this list, right? Again, the number of parents and ancestors is pretty low. The number of children and descendants is really high, so that means they tend to be at the beginning and they tend to generate a lot of responses. I mentioned follow-up. I also want to pull that out real quick here. If you look at where these are, can you guys see those little orange arrows in the back? Some people, okay. So the follow-up messages are kind of interesting because these are ones that I said, a little bit of time has elapsed, and then they go back and like kind of let people know how things went. If they may have, asked a question of the group, which would have been like seeking an opinion. Hey, I'm having trouble with people participating in groups. Like, how do you handle it, right? And then 2 months later, they might say, hey, thanks for all the feedback. I tried it. Here's how it went, right? So if you notice where these are, in a lot of cases, they create other branches here, right? So this message had all these responses, and that probably would have been the end of the thread until this person followed up with it here, and then all of this came off of the follow-up. Same thing here. Somebody followed up again later, and this whole little branch here comes off. So the follow-up messages tend to be bridges between these discussions. They tend to bring on new groups of discussions. And this is an important feature, especially with that idea of reconfirmation, that you're getting ideas, you're testing them out, you're getting feedback. The follow-up is a good idea, good way to picture that, how it's happening in the list here, that it's creating all the discussion. Okay, so just because listservs are there doesn't mean they always work. It doesn't mean they're always helpful. Right? So how do you create a network like this? We've seen lots of examples of how people use this to get information and get their questions answered. But how do you actually create a network like this if you're in charge of faculty developers or creating a listserv? So one thing that pops out is there's a lot of community building going on in here. If we just look at the messages where the main function was to celebrate, offer emotional support, thank, or a social connection, it's only about building community, right? Not necessarily related to mathematical teaching or anything like that. That's the main function of about 31% of the messages on the list. Another 45 messages included aspects. So that may be something like,
here's how you do group work, here's how I do group work, but thanks, that was a great question, or something like that. You know, it's not the main focus, but it's still in the message. So together, it's almost half of the messages, which is pretty remarkable, you know. You've got a group of 45 mathematicians here, and about half of their messages are supporting each other emotionally. You know, you don't always see that on listservs, so it's pretty cool. But one caveat for this is that this group did all know each other in person. They went to a workshop together. This may not always be the case, but this seems to be key to making it work, is building community. Here's what it looks like visually if we only highlight the community of the messages. Thank you. So notice a lot of the network is highlighted there with community building. All right, so specifically the way that you can do this as a leader is by inviting participation. So here I've only highlighted the messages where the leader sent to invite people to participate. These could be things as simple as like, hey, the first day of classes are coming up, what are your plans? Or, you know, you just had the first day of classes, how'd it go? Or, you know, stuff like that. Or, we want to hear from you, it's been quiet for a while, check in, let us know how things are going, right? Anything to invite participation. So you see that it happens quite a bit throughout the list. So this one is kind of interesting. So basically what I've done is taken all this data sequentially. So basically we start at midnight here, at 12, and then just go around in sequential order. So the gaps between them are not necessarily meaningful. Notice all the activity here. January comes here, right? This is actually January here because there was so much more activity in the front half of the year. But if we take away the participant messages and only look at the leader messages, notice how at the beginning, there's lots of those orange codes to invite participation. And then for a long stretch, it kind of goes on its own, right? Leaders are just kind of responding to questions here and there, sometimes sharing some resources, but they're not having to check in with people and ask them to participate, right? They do a lot of the work up front, and then the listserv maintains itself. January comes, they start prompting people again, and then again, you know, as the year continues, occasionally they send prompts to get it right. So that prompting is important and that it's relevant. Okay. So another thing I want to draw your attention to here, some other things that leaders can do on these listservs. So if we look at just the participant messages here, so again, these are just the circles, just the participants that are here. Notice this row of single response messages. Almost all of the initiating messages are from participants. If we switch to staff, or to leaders, almost all of the responses come from the leaders. Right, so one key here is do not let the messages go unanswered on a list. If people are trying to use it as a resource, make it a resource. If nobody's responding to them, you need to be the ones to do that so that they know this is a place they can go to get their questions answered. I'm going to go back to participants again. Notice how many of the complex discussions then eventually start from participants. How many of those, the top message in these little subnetworks down here, are all coming from participants. Okay, so if we look at just the things that the leaders do on the list, right, here's what the network looks like. If I remove all the other stuff, so it's easier to kind of see what's going on here, we'll notice sometimes, you know, the leaders are answering questions, sometimes providing opinions, providing information, but a lot of what's up here is these yellow connections, which are thanking people for participating, empathizing, some green, some social. This actually looks pretty similar to that community building slide, right? Organizers are doing a lot of that. So make sure messages don't go unanswered, but also let things simmer for a little while. The same way you would do in a classroom if you want your students to be active, you don't want to jump in immediately after you answer or ask a question. Give the participants some time to respond to them. Let them simmer, and then what you can do is thank the participants to keep that going and say, we value this, thanks for taking part in it. So once the community is established as a resource, I promise I'm really close. Once the community is established as a resource, participants actually use the resource. So these are just the first message every participant sent to the list. Notice how many of them are people seeking opinions that generated discussion. Once you build that community, people will use it as a resource. It's also useful even in inactive participants. So these 6 are people who said, I haven't really been participating, or I haven't participated at all yet, but I've been reading everything and it's been helpful. So even if they're not participating, having those discussions going can still help people who are inactive on the list. And then eventually participants become the community. Notice when we only look at participant stuff here, the network doesn't change that drastically if we get rid of, too many clicks there, if we get rid of the staff stuff, right? So participants end up taking over the vast majority of this community once you put in the effort at the beginning to make sure it's a useful resource for you. All right, so real quick, just the practical implications, kind of a summary slide here. Build a community, persistently invite participation, provide emotional support. And two things you can do, kind of let things simmer, transfer the authority to your group, just like you would in an IBL classroom. We talked about that a lot since these are IBL workshops. And then relevant prompting keeps it going, and also a low floor. It's easier to ask, what are you doing versus how did it go? And then the individual check-ins. So I'll leave those up there, but that's it. Thank you for coming.